Ours is an age assailed by innumerable ethical responsibilities. Of course, humans of every era have found themselves confronted with problems in all walks of life, and whether by direct affliction or moved by empathy, they sought to resolve them. However, we should note that the relationship that we have to our present problems is not quite the same as the relationship our forebears would have had to theirs. This is due to the nature of modern media and communication. Put simply, while in the past our forebears would have been concerned primarily with local problems, perhaps at most something spanning across a kingdom or an empire, for us, our political problems are in large part global. Given the technology we have available to us, we are incessantly messaged about the state of crisis that every part of the world seems to be enduring. As the ever sagacious Nick Cave has recently said, we are presented with a constant communique of despair, that we exist in the worst of times, indeed, the end of times. I wouldn't be the first, I think, to observe that this has a fairly detrimental effect. For a single person to be presented with such a vast litany of problems that all seem so much larger than them is to almost necessarily confine them to a state of perpetual anxiety and upset. This is worsened by the fact that for many of us, simply by our existence and placement in society, are unwillingly complicit in the issues at hand, and so feel even more guilt as a result of our peace and safety. Modern media seems, in most cases, to produce a general atmosphere of hopelessness and despair, and therefore ultimately it really makes the world a worse place rather than any better. No doubt this is in part because there are some people in the media who really don't care that much about the issues being discussed and would far prefer just to squirrel as much money out of the topics as possible by stoking the flames of hatred between human beings. Has any genuine benefit ever really come, for example, from a debate hosted by Piers Morgan? But Piers Morgan and his kind are famous for a reason, in spite of contributing nothing but further animosity and spite to culture. As many people have pointed out, we suffer from something of an addiction to anger and outrage and offence, and a lot of what social media has cultivated in us, but also profited from, is our propensity to be drawn into these fights. We're very often lured into propagating the culture war, broadly speaking, simply in order to make a profit for social media companies who know that we can't help but tell someone they're an idiot online if they say something we disagree with. However, I'd also like to highlight that although that's well documented, I think there's another reason involved that causes us to upset ourselves when perhaps we need not. We in the West, dare I say because of a certain theological heritage, have an inclination to treat shame, and generally a prolongation of guilt, as useful, and sometimes even positive features of morality. The result is that we often mix ethical behaviour with self-persecution, and so take perpetual worry and anxiety and despair even to rather implicitly be a positive sign that we are caring about the issues at hand. Implicitly, we might even take it to be a noble endeavour, sacrificing one's own happiness in solidarity with another. But this is dangerous. Because it is driven by a very good, decent and empathetic impulse to make the world a better place and care for people who are less fortunate, we find it difficult to highlight and pinpoint just where its flaw lies. But we should remind ourselves that there are bad ways of trying to be good. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. When we receive medicine, we receive it with instructions, because otherwise it can be harmful for us, even though it has the intention of doing us good. We must likewise ask, when it comes to morality, not the question of whether or not we should be good, because that's a non-question, but how we should go about living in order to realise goodness. In order to answer this question, I want to draw on some small slivers of wisdom inherent in the great religious traditions. Metropolitan Kallistos Ware describes a passage from Saint Barsanuphios of Gaza, a 6th century hermit who lived in Palestine. I'll read the passage in full. At the present time, there are 3 persons whose prayers protect this wicked and sinful generation from the wrath of God. Because of these 3 persons and their prayers, the world continues in being. And then St. Barsanuphios mentions their names. John, he says, is one of them, Elias is the second, and the third is a person in the province of Jerusalem. Now the third person presumably designated himself living at Gaza. But the first 2, John and Elias, are otherwise totally unknown to us. So here we have the word of a saint, gifted with insight, that the people who were preserving the world from destruction in his day were 3 persons, 2 of whom are entirely unknown to history, and the third of whom was a hermit in the desert. The most important people in any generation are not necessarily those whose names are prominent in the history books. We also find a similar idea in the Sufi order of Abdal, 40 people who are supposed to be dedicated to prayer their entire lives and sustain the world in prayer, and whose identities are known to no one but God himself. What is being suggested here? Notice the contrast that holds here between the individuals in terms of their historical notability and their spiritual gravity. These are the people who never led any revolutions, who never marched on Washington to put legislation into effect. These are people who wouldn't even really be considered contributors politically. When we see tragedy on the news today, this is hardly the kind of lifestyle we are drawn to in response. Rather, our impulse is typically one of heroism. We wish to do what we can to fight climate change, to bring peace in the Middle East, to bring love and understanding between hateful people. But in so doing, we implicitly arrogate to ourselves the interventionist role, and then subsequently despair over the vast size and complexity of the issues that we have obliged ourselves to remedy. But what if it were the other way round? What if we identified that there is a latent egoism in a lot of our political action, and that in order to truly do good in the world, that's what we needed to eliminate? Rather than our first thought being, in response to the world's problems, how can I go out and fix the world and make it better? The opposite. What if it were the case that in response to the world's problems, I took the time to look within myself and fix my inner world, rather than immediately, at least, the outer? Yes, our modern minds scoff at the idea, but dare I say that's because morality in our modern day is so often divorced from its metaphysical origin. The impulses which drive a lot of our morality, after all, are explicitly religious. At least in the West, the assumption of the universal dignity of all people, the absolute spiritual equality of everyone under God, the duty of the rich to take care of the poor, all of these are Judeo-Christian in nature. But many seem to lose religion in the modern day and therefore lose the rationale behind their impulses. But the reasoning behind what they're doing seems to fall away, and so the actions themselves become arbitrary. They become essentially just personal convictions rather than anything that appeals to a universal metaphysics. The consequence of this is that our ethical lives are really now just husks of their former selves, without that wisdom that originally gave rise to these moral principles. Once it's unmoored from those traditions, it sort of loses track of how best to go about realizing this goodness. Because if we return to those traditions, we find not just an absolute reinforcement of our need to act politically and ethically, but moreover a guide for how to go about that, for how not to be overcome with despair, as so many people seem to be struggling with in our day and age. Now, this wisdom is difficult to digest, even for pre-modern people who were thoroughly religious. Rowan Williams, in one of his books, The Passions of the Soul, emphasises how difficult it must have been for desert ascetics in the early Christian centuries to combat the, I think what John Cassian, I believe it was, called the noonday demon of listlessness or Acadia. Williams cites a passage from Evagrius Ponticus, and highlights how even those actions which themselves seem very much oriented toward good and concerned with making the world a better place, and might tangibly do that, ultimately serve the ego that acts rather than God. Evagrius notes how the monks who committed themselves to a solitary life, a life dedicated purely to God, would very often sort of grow restless, maybe about midday, hence the nickname, feeling like with their spiritual disposition and their vast learning, they could go out and better the world. They could do so much more than simply weave baskets and beg for food and sing psalms until sundown. There's so much more they could be doing with themselves. But in so doing, they've moved away from their real goal, away from God, and towards something that, although ostensibly good on the surface, is still just a transient, finite, passing act. Even if it's good as opposed to bad, it is finite, it is transient. And so it's not really what the religious life calls you to be dedicated to. What the contemplative life wishes to make us aware of is the fact that there is something else that needs to take our priority, what in theistic traditions we call God. And it's that you go to first, and then from that first movement, ethical actions, political activism will follow naturally. If you get the order mixed up, if you go straight for the politics and then sort of forget about God and come to him later, you have a lot of problems ensue. One of them being the realization that you can't solve these problems on your own, that it's all too big for you, that the world is full of so much evil that you are bound to fall into despair. Of course, I have to absolutely insist that this can't replace or excuse a lack of political or ethical action in the world. It's really the opposite of what I'm saying. It's simply clarifying our order of priorities. You go first to God, and then allow morality to flow from it naturally. The logos of what you're doing, to use the Greek term, the reason, the ratio in the Latin, that needs to be your center. If you lose that, you sort of go way off course. But if you manage to stay with that, you stay with what's eternal, what's abiding, what persists, then all the transient, finite manifestations of that fall into place on their own. To use an image from one of the most important, I believe, one of the most important passages in the history of human literature, Tao Te Ching, chapter 38, we're looking to abide in the fruit, not the flower. The Tao Te Ching in general is a fantastic text to show just what I'm trying to get at here. You abide first in the way, and then good deeds, good practice, everything else will follow. But if you lose the way and you start clinging to good deeds, you start clinging to rituals, disaster follows. This message resounds throughout that text. So this is really about not mistaking the wood for the trees. Ethical and political action are really much better seen as positive symptoms of an inner poise, an inner stillness, a hesychia, to use the term from Eastern Orthodoxy. You abide first in God, and then your actions are signs that you're living properly in God. If you get those mixed up, you're bound to fall into despair. As I said, this is because, as Evagrius noted, if you just turn to the actions themselves, you are implicitly stating that you're the hero that's going to fix it, that you know what you're doing on your own. And so what you suffer from, and Rowan Williams has talked about this extensively elsewhere in his work, is you forget that you are really rather dependent on other things. Firstly, on everything else in the world, you're dependent on other people to be born and raised, dependent on food to survive and shelter and all these different things. But then also, ultimately, on God, without which none of those things in existence would be at all. This remembrance of dependence is vital for the way we conduct ourselves in the world. All our pretensions to heroism, our ventures to take the world on as a burden and fix it all ourselves, be the saviour, the messiah of the world ourselves, all these evaporate when we realise that we are just one thread in an infinite tapestry whose grand design is beyond our greatest faculty of comprehension. So, if we recognise this, how do we then turn back to the world? How do we start to live in remembrance of our dependence both on the world and God, and what does that then mean for our actions? Well, the first thing to do is to problematize an age-old division that holds in some religious traditions between the active and the contemplative ways of living. In Christian tradition, these are often symbolized in terms of Rachel and Leah, or Martha and Mary, the second of which being based on that passage in the Gospels where Jesus is speaking to Martha and Mary. One of them is rushing around trying to prepare everything. The other is simply sitting in front of Jesus in stillness and focusing on him. And when Martha complains and says, "Why isn't Mary doing anything?" Jesus says, "There is one thing that matters." But although there are practical distinguishments, living in a monastery is going to be different from living in the city, what I want to suggest is that we should more keenly recognise that the active and the contemplative are simply one continuum, rather than discrete categorical labels. I think Sikh tradition provides a very good example of what I mean. Famously, Sikhism prohibits monasticism. You cannot be a Sikh monk. You can't become a hermit or an anchorite in the Sikh tradition. You are obliged to remain and fulfill your domestic duties, to remember God in your community, especially in your kitchen, and so serve God by serving other people. Now, whether or not you think that abolition of monasticism should be ubiquitous, which I don't necessarily, I want to stress how valuable it is in reminding us that there should really be an integration of the contemplative and the active. Meditation and prayer are not something you do separate from the rest of your life. Yes, it's true that you should, find a solitary space and, lock the door and be in stillness and quiet on your own. But what you're discovering there is the truth of existence itself, the truth of your existence. And so something that necessarily very much applies to whatever active endeavor you're undertaking once you get on with your day. If we can slowly reintegrate the contemplative into the active, or perhaps vice versa, then we are able to approach all aspects of the active life with a greater mindfulness and a greater clarity in terms of what we need to do. So I would insist that, contrary to certain, usually Marxist critiques, contemplative or mystical practice is not apolitical, and it's not amoral. It's not a retreat from the world. Again, especially Marxists will often say that it's just abdicating your social responsibility, but Marxism has the great failing of being a materialistic philosophy, and so measures the value of life in the arid exchange of economic units. And so naturally you wouldn't have the faculty as a Marxist to be able to see what is being discovered and what the value is of contemplation. Meditation and prayer, making time for these every day, is not some failure of social responsibility, but I would go so far as to argue a real praxis, a real effort to change the world, absolutely in its material form as much as in its spiritual. Prayer transfigures every aspect of your existence, and so will necessarily affect and augment your political and ethical life in such a way that trying to attend to those issues in themselves, your ego trying to fix them in themselves, could never manage. Rather than rushing out and insisting on your ego fixing the world, start by accepting that you are small, that you are limited, that you are dependent, that you are mortal. All these other things that are true to our humanity that we don't really like to realize, but that if we forget, result in our misery and our anger. Attempt instead to slowly cultivate a light within you, realizing that what you're discovering in your contemplation and in your meditation is something that is good on its own. You don't need to put your hands on it, you don't need to control it, you don't need to grip it as tightly as possible to make sure it goes the way you want it to go. With our return to religion, and with our return to mysticism specifically, our ethics come simply as the emanation of an inner light, a light that is always already infinitely good, that will then begin to manifest in our actions and in our relationships with other people and the material circumstances of our lives. You can often see quite clearly when people haven't taken the time to cultivate their own character, even people in religious roles. In conflict, their first port of call is to try and prove how right they are, to essentially dominate the conversation, dominate the debate, rather than taking the time to listen, rather than accepting that they are small and limited and ignorant in many ways, because that's what human existence is like. And so part of being a human being and part of growing as a human being is accepting that and knowing that you can learn things from other people. As I say, this is indicative of rushing to the event itself, forgetting God, not having any real sort of metaphysical grounding or religious grounding behind you, not really being comfortable with the light within, but wanting your ego to be the one that fixes everything. So in this way, it's sort of normal that you'll be paranoidally concerned with winning every debate that you're in, because it's your ego that's on the line. You don't want to be humiliated. Your pride is there, and your pride wants to dictate how the world's going to be. But if you meet someone who has taken the time to cultivate their character, you will know. They won't need to persuade you with frantic arguments or apologetics or anything in between. They won't feel the need to grab you by, metaphorically or literally sometimes, grab you by the throat and shake you until you agree with them. Their being alone, with its calmness, its stillness, its earnest and honest listening, its full comfort and awareness of the fact that it's not them that creates goodness, but God, that will be all the evidence you need. That will be inherently attractive to you. And you will see that with clarity as the way that human beings should be. And that if every human being in the world were like that, the world would be a tangibly better place. There is an important, dare I say even a sacred irony here. It's only when we let go of our attempts to fix the world ourselves that we discover that we actually have a lot more influence than we originally thought. Even if you were a monk and you lived in a hut in the woods, and the only person you ever met for 40 years was some small boy who would bring you food every week, you're essentially cut off from the world in a political sense. But the fact that you spend that time meditating and contemplating and cultivating your virtue will have a tangible effect on that boy. They will remember you positively, and they will grow, and they will have a sense, perhaps at their midlife crisis a few years later, they will think, what does it mean to be alive? Why do I exist? Everything I've tried to achieve has fallen to straw. But then they remember you, and they have an impression of what it's like to be fully content with almost nothing, and suddenly they're working at a food bank. Suddenly they're working at a homeless shelter, and that is your effect, even though you were cut off from, everyone almost. That's your effect, tangibly helping the world. What might the world look like if everyone took the time to cultivate their character in meditation and in prayer, to draw themselves back to their being, and so let go of all the paranoia which makes them cling to their lives? Your interaction with your roommate when you wake up in the morning and make them coffee, your interaction with the bus driver when you thank them with a nice smile after you get off, your interaction with the receptionist at work after you compliment her shirt. These things flow from cultivating a sense of joy, gratitude, and love, really. I mean, that's sort of the key word, is love for your own life. And that has a positive effect on the people around you. Recognizing your dependence on the world also allows you to recognize your influence on it. The smallest tweak of your behavior can send ripples and then even waves through the course of history. We know how much people are affected by the psychology of their parents. What might it be like if you took the time now to break a bad habit, to lower your anger, to lower your anxiety, by meditation, by prayer, how much might that affect your child, whether now or in the future? And then how much might that affect their children in turn, and their children in turn? It'll never make the news. You'll never make the news because you decided to meditate and get rid of your anger problem. You know, you're not going to... I mean, actually, that would make you a bad candidate for a Piers Morgan debate, right? So that you won't be notable in history. You won't have achieved something enormous, but you will have, in an obvious sense that is simply just not calculable in the usual metrics by which we measure everything else. Your small attempt to clean up your little corner of the world makes everyone's world a little bit brighter. And that sounds horribly cliche, I know, but it is also deeply, deeply true. Who can calculate just what generational trauma might cease, what wars and feuds might come to an end, and so what lives might be saved, because we in our generation took the time to be still, to draw our being back into itself, rather than being lost in the world, and so did what we needed to cry, to scream, to thump the wall, to shake, and then return again and again to stillness in order to slowly feel through the complexes and the prejudices which we inherited from our parents. To sit still each day for 5 to 15 short minutes and to meditate is to change the world. St. Seraphim of Sarov, 19th century Russian Orthodox starets, once famously said that if you acquire the spirit of peace, thousands around you will be saved. Or, in the words of another figure of relative authority in the Christian tradition, although his name is eluding me now, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. Do you hear this? Do you hear this audio? Isn't this glorious? At last, a microphone of good quality. I've got rid of the background white noise. I'm very, very happy. Hopefully this means my technological woes are behind me and so I won't have as many delays as I have had so far, and I can get back to schedule. Thank you all so much for your patience. I hope you've had a very, very peaceful Christmas and a calm transition into the new year. God bless.